This is my memory for August 10th, 2020. This is day 35 of 366. And yesterday, thinking about my birthday party and sharing that story, I remembered a night that didn't happen at my birthday party, but wound up becoming commemorated during one of my birthday parties. And the night itself it was a very hot summer night. My friend Frank and I were hanging out down on one of the church steps that we used to always hang out on. Where we grew up. There was a very small area. It was less than a mile circumference around the entire area, and within that 1 mile circumference, there were 13 different churches and something like 17 different bars and clubs. So that was the area that we grew up in. Every church had its own. There was the Slovak band hall, the Croatian band hall, the Polski Dome. There was all the different ethnicities had their own little bar or club, and everybody had their own church. The Hungarian church, the Protestants, all that. The Russian church, Russian Orthodox, all that. So we would hang out on various church steps. This was, uh, I'd say mid '80s, mid to late '80s, and on this one particular one church was on Broad Street. It was on Route 56. It was the main route that ran through the town, and the church was right alongside that on a sidewalk. And we would hang out there a good bit, just talk about whatever, watch cars go by, and so on. We were hanging out there one night, and Gary, who I've mentioned multiple times in the first 35 days, suddenly comes just flying by in his car, and he like pulls over and leans out the passenger side window. He's like, "Hey, what are you guys up to right now?" And we're like, "Just nothing. Hang on." He goes, "You have to come with me and see something. Hurry up, meet me down Aces." And so me and Frank get up and we run down. We get down to Aces, and we're like, "What's up?" And Gary's like, "Come on, you gotta come with me. Let's get into the van." And there was an old. I've always had wheelchair vans, with lifts on them, to get in and out of my vehicle. And at least one of them, when it stopped being really functional for the wheelchair lift, it had wound up with Gary, and Gary used it for years as a catering van. But the lift, the wheelchair lift on the side of it, still more or less worked. It wasn't a lock to work every time, um, but that never stopped us anyway. So we wind up, lowering down the lift, getting up into the van, and we go driving out to a place called The Road. On The Road is uh, it was an old abandoned road that there was the area that we grew up, which was in Cambria City of Johnstown. Then there was a bridge that led across the Conemaugh River and went to Minersville. And Minersville was another small town that was put up on the side of a hill. And if you went all the way back to Minersville, all the way to the back end of Minersville, Honan Avenue, which is where Woob, which I've also mentioned previously, Woob lived in the last house on the right. So he lived there, and then right after Woob's house, the road had stopped being maintained after the 1977 flood. So there was a road that still ran all the way out to Hingston Run Dam, about 3.5 miles away. But the road had just become completely, uh, uh, you know, uh, I don't want to say destroyed. I mean, you could still walk it. You could still drive on it. Although there was one time where there was a guy in this sports car who had come up, and me and I can't remember who else, me, somebody else, and Woob were talking in front of his house, and he comes up in this sports car. It's got like you know, an inch, 2 inch clearance. And it's like, hey, I'm trying to get out to Hinks Run Dam. Is this the road that leads there? And we kind of looked at him, and Woob looked down at his car, and was just, uh, yeah, but not in that car. And so it was that kind of road. I mean, it was all just, it wasn't just paved with potholes or anything like that. I mean, it was torn up. It was completely, there were parts we had to pick. Where do I go here to get by this section? And so we wound up driving down the road in the van. It was a full size van, and this is late at night. I mean, well, I don't know how late, but definitely well after dark. 9:30, 10 o'clock, something like that. And we go out, maybe halfway out, maybe mile and a quarter, somewhere a mile and a half, somewhere in that uh, distance range. And there was no moon. It was overcast. There were no stars. And we stop, park, turn off the headlights, and then immediately fireflies everywhere. I mean, everywhere. I've seen fireflies before, where there are hundreds or thousands of them. This was unbelievable. They were flying, they were crawling on the road, they were crawling on the trees, and they were on the hillside. They were landing on the van after we had parked. They were everywhere, and so within moments, you lost track of where you were. It almost felt like you were floating. It was very disorienting because you couldn't focus on anything. It would fade in, fade out. You weren't sure what was solid, what wasn't. Some of them would be floating by altogether, and you'd think, "Is that the ground moving?" It was just so. It was unbelievable. We sat there for I don't know how long, and eventually we were like, okay, we need to leave. No other cars came by the entire time because it wasn't like people drove out that way. But we just sat there and talked, and we're like, oh, you can't believe it. This was way before the days of cell phones or anything like that. So there's no pictures or anything to commemorate it, but I'll never forget that night. And then either later that year or the next year is we turned into the uh, we at my birthday party. I was telling this story. Me and Gary and Frank were all relaying this story as to what had happened. I think it must have been a year later, and we were talking about, yeah, last year was unbelievable. It was like this, and we turned into the if ever I saw 1,000 Fireflies song, which was a song that we went around in a one by one, each of the people at the main table of the party, with no pre-planning as to what was the next verse going to be, and just started to sing the song, and created this song, and went. It was hilarious, and maybe someday we will sing it uh, for a recording and get it down. But that's my memory of the day. My night of 1,000 fireflies.